How do you think cannibalism would function under capitalism? If you've ever thought about this, then I have the book for you. Tender is the Flesh is by an Argentine author named Agustina Bazterrica. Sorry, I know I'm not pronouncing her name very well. I can't roll my R's. I would call this book a dystopian story with some body horror and anti-capitalist elements thrown in. This book is definitely not for those who have a weak stomach. I'm normally someone who isn't bothered like that. I have a pretty strong stomach when it comes to like watching pretty gross horror movies, and I can still eat like through the whole thing. But there were a couple times during this book where I did have to like pause because I felt a little uneasy about what I was reading. So I just wanted to get that out of the way before I start talking about the story, that it can get pretty graphic and intense about what the themes and what the actual narrative is about. Within the first couple pages, we find out that there was a virus that infected all, if not most, of the animals on Earth that made them poisonous for human consumption. We don't really get a lot more details on like what the virus was, how, or why it happened, and at first it kind of bothered me, but once I got into the story, I got really wrapped up into the consequences of that happening that it didn't really take away from me enjoying the book at all. After the public's craving for meat reaches a boiling point, the government legalizes cannibalism and it becomes industrialized and standardized, and it's become known as special meat. And it's interesting because people know that humans are being bred in captivity specifically for consumption, but nobody's really allowed to directly refer to what's actually happening. They use terms like product or special meat. It's kind of become a taboo subject to really dance around the issue that people are eating other people. We're introduced to this world through our protagonist and point of view character Marcos. Marcos is the general manager for one of the most reputable processing plants since the transition to special meat. He's basically in charge of the daily operations, all the processes, and all of the staff who work at the plant. Right off the bat, pretty much right at the beginning of the book, we're taken through a typical work day right along with Marcos. And I think what really adds to the horror is the entirely matter-of-fact way he describes what's going on in the processing plant. He walks us through how the product is shipped in, inspected, and then prepared for slaughter. And the whole time this is going on, you need to remember that these are humans that are being brought in, humans that were bred specifically for consumption. And so that really just adds to the horrific description of how these people are being slaughtered, and it's just another typical day at work for Marcos and all of the staff. The narrative goes into pretty intense detail about the preparations that the staff are making to basically cut the product into pieces and specific cuts of meat that are shipped out to various customers like butchers and high-end retailers. We learned that when the transition happened, not many people who worked in the meat processing industry were able to stomach the transition to processing this new special meat. Marcos, our protagonist, is one of the few people who's been able to make that transition and do this work and continue doing the work extremely well and for a pretty long time. I won't spoil anything, but as we get further in the story, we learn Marcos doesn't really have a choice and he needs to continue doing this kind of work because it's really the only work he's known how to do his entire life. And I think that explains why he's so cold and detached when he talks about the processes and every step along the way of processing the meat. I mean, I think you kind of have to leave your body if you're going to do this kind of work. The narrative horror in Tender is the Flesh kind of feels like a weighted blanket that's draped over the entire story. But then there's also this feeling of longing and sadness that's just weaved beautifully in throughout the entire book. The virus didn't just make animals poisonous for humans to consume, it also made it pretty deadly if you were to get just a scratch or a bite from any animal, and so animals were gathered and killed en masse, and that includes all of the pets everybody owned. So there's these moments of melancholy when characters are reflecting on what it was like to play with a dog or trying to remember what it felt like to pet a cat because nobody can do that anymore. These simple but extremely meaningful animal-human relationships that we've taken for granted are now gone forever. And we feel these memories through Marcus as he provides a brief respite from the harsh and cruel meat processing world, and he slows down and thinks about childhood memories, and he thinks about some dogs that he used to have when he was younger. Now, the real villain of the story, if we had to pick one, is capitalism, and more specifically, it's neoliberal capitalism. Once we get a good idea of how this first level of the new meat processing system works, we follow Marcus through a more administrative workday. We watch him as he meets with his boss, who is the actual owner of the processing plant, and they discuss day-to-day issues like hiring staff who can handle the psychological strain of the kind of work they have to do, and resolving issues with the breeder about how product is being damaged, being shipped from the breeder to the slaughterhouse. And speaking of the breeder, we do get a pretty detailed rundown about how humans are bred in captivity for human consumption. We follow Marcus as he goes from the slaughterhouse to the breeder to the butchers to other high-end customers, and we watch him emotionally get worn down having to conduct these business meetings in such a cold and detached manner. The wealth and power these people have amassed in this new meat processing system is on full display as we watch as they literally eat other humans they deem lesser than them. I've really only talked about the logistics and consequences of this new system and just some of the psychological effects it has on our protagonist, but once we get further in the narrative, there are many more other character dynamics at play, like Marcos has a whole conflict with his family that he also has to deal with. But there is a central conflict and a surprise catalyst that kind of gets everything moving that I won't spoil because it was really satisfying to read as it was unfolding in real time and just kind of figure out what was exactly going on. So yeah, if you can stomach the idea of cannibalism and learning in extreme detail the ins and outs of how the meat processing industry would function under capitalism, then I would give Tender is the Flesh a read. The true horror is the mundane acceptance that people have resigned themselves to because the corporate and government powers have pretty much left them no choice. They know all about the brutality going on behind the scenes, but are essentially powerless to do anything about it. And much like our protagonist Marcos, they just have to figure out where they fit in this system, do the best they can to cope, keep their heads down, and try not to get eaten by capitalism.